Thank you for joining us. We have, I think, an interesting program in store for you, not just a single presentation, but a number of reflections about the recent Orthodox Christian Jewish dialogue event that took place in Geneva at the beginning of December. Some educational projects that are coming out of that, as well as out of our own group, Orthodox Christians in Dialogue with Jews, and we'll have different kinds of discussions this evening, around that. I want to just start us off, though, with a bit of prayer, and in light of, I think, a lot of us feeling rather pummeled, whether it's by the world news that is unrelenting, or whether it's recent storms that we've faced here in North America and apparently as well in Poland. We pray Psalms 84, 85, 86 every day at ninth hour in the Orthodox liturgy of the hours. And I was really struck today by some verses from Psalm 85, and I thought I would share them with you. So let's pray. Let me hear what God the Lord will speak, for he will speak peace to his people, to his faithful, to those who turn to him in their hearts. Surely his salvation is at hand for those who fear him, that his glory may dwell in our land. Steadfast love and faithfulness will meet, righteousness and peace will kiss each other. Faithfulness will spring up from the ground, and righteousness will look down from the sky. The Lord will give what is good, and our land will yield its increase. Righteousness will go before him and will make a path for his steps. Amen.
Amen.
May we be reassured by that the Lord will speak peace to his people. I think many of us are feeling the need to for that word of peace to come to us. Again, welcome all of you. I'm going to introduce, first of all, Father Michael Azar, who is on our steering committee of Orthodox Christians in Dialogue with Jews. He is also was present with us at the Geneva Academic Consultation last month, and we're going to speak a little bit about that. But for those of you who don't know Father Michael, he has PhD in New Testament from Fordham and an MA in theology from St. Vladimir's. He's currently professor of theology and religious studies at the University of Scranton, where he teaches primarily on the Bible, early Christianity, and Christianity in the Middle East. His current research focuses on ancient and modern Christian-Jewish interaction, particularly in the light of Orthodox Christian hermeneutics and the historic presence of Orthodox Christianity in the Holy Land. And last year he was ordained priest serves in the Greek Archdiocese, although on loan, I believe, still to the Carpatho-Russians at this moment. So Father Michael, I've asked you to come and share a little bit about the experience of Geneva last month, what even is this academic consultation, that this was the 12th iteration of what its history's been, what your experiences, were of that. And we've got some other participants here as well who were there last month, so we might even kind of open up this discussion a little bit more amongst us. But over to you to begin our reflections on this sort of high-level dialogue event that took place.
Thank you. Yeah. I had planned a few more formal things to say, but I see the group is small enough that I can really just maybe open up, just raise a few things for discussion, especially since there are at least a few other people here, as Father Jeffrey said, that were also in Geneva, and I'd like to hear other people's impressions as well. But for those that are less familiar, I'll give a little bit of the background of these meetings, for those that are unfamiliar, and then also talk more specifically a little bit about the two meetings that I have now personally helped organize and then also attended, which are the 11th and 12th meeting, and then especially the most recent one last month in Geneva. Um, so, and if at any point I say too much or too little, feel free to stop me. Again, it's a small crowd. But as many of you probably here know, Jewish-Christian dialogue really began after World War II as an international movement. But long story short, and you can pretty much assume the phrase long story short will be attached to almost everything that I'll say. But long story short, Orthodox Christians were largely uninvolved in the formation of Jewish-Christian dialogue, which was first Well, for the most of the early year, primarily on the Christian side, Protestant driven, and then eventually after the 1960s, largely Catholic driven. Um, and then in the 1970s, Orthodox Christians and Jews began meeting together in a more formal basis, first organized here domestically, um, in 1972, but then on the international level, after failed attempts by the World Council of Churches to start a bilateral dialogue between Orthodox Christians and Jews, we kind of took it upon ourselves and did it our own, largely starting because of 1976 speech by Metropolitan Damaskinos of Switzerland on Jewish-Christian relations from an Orthodox perspective, although it gets in more detail. That speech, I think, for the first time in the coming year, will be published, translated and published from the academic German. Um, it has never been published up until now. But so it encouraged sort of uh, a new avenue for Orthodox Christian Jewish bilateral meetings. And as many here probably know who are familiar with this era on the Orthodox side, this was an era of increased Orthodox ecumenical, interreligious, and interchurch relations, largely facilitated by the Patriarchal Institute Chambézy in Switzerland, where much of this dialogue also got off the ground. Um, so the first academic meeting, as it was called, the bilateral meeting between Orthodox Christians and Jews was in 1977. And the first three were largely dealt with theological, historical, and spiritual topics, kind of quite significant discussions of theology and practice of the two traditions. In the time since, starting in the late 90s, it has been primarily addressing um, sort of issues facing both traditions common. So rather than facing each other, they were kind of facing outward together. So rather than discussing differences amongst themselves, they more tried to, came together to dialogue to promote sort of a common um, face to issues facing them together, like prejudice or something like that. Uh, in Vienna in 2022 was the 11th meeting, and in that discussion, as at least from what I see on this, Rick Marker would remember well. Uh, um, we sort of realized the need to have a more robust way to communicate to our respective traditions what they ought to know about the other. And that started work on a common document that I think Father Jeffrey will come back around to mention later. Um, but that started work on a common document that is currently being shaped, that will hopefully have more of an official stamp of approval to it from both sides. Sort of a significant handout to each tradition to describe or what they ought to know by the other. So in Geneva, we met together for the 12th meeting. It was addressing sanctity of place and sanctity of space. There were a variety of presentations that I think maybe others can comment on. Some perhaps a little more relevant and better than others, perhaps. Um, and what I found personally very beneficial, as I did in Geneva, were the more one-on-one personal contacts that developed um, on the sidelines. I was tasked, being that this was the 50th anniversary or is approaching the 50th anniversary of the dialogue, I was tasked on the first evening to present the quote history and orientation of the dialogue. So I did a historical overview. And though there was some debate afterward, I took the word orientation to describe future avenues. And given the environment in which we live and the troubles and problems we see, I took it as a chance to ask what I felt were tough and necessary questions of both sides as future avenue, to sort of lay out a possible future avenues for dialogue. Um, because I don't think dialogue is about necessarily answering and asking easy questions, but tough questions, especially when you encounter, if it's bilateral, especially when you encounter a tradition for whom the questions are important and unique. So to the Orthodox Christian side, I raised questions of anti-Semitism in Orthodox countries, as well as the issue of our liturgy, which has come up numerous times in the past, and its portrayal of the Jews, most famously in Holy Week. Um, in short, what can we do about this in the future? And to the Jewish side, so to speak, I asked questions of biblical chosenness and how concepts of chosenness can be misused or used in the contemporary Middle East, and especially the last 3 years. Um, and This spurred some better discussions than others, perhaps. That again, I'll let others comment on if they so choose. Um, and the one memorable part from the Geneva meeting, given that it is approaching the 50th anniversary, was a much appreciated and necessary tribute to Metropolitan Damaskinos of Switzerland, who really was both Orthodox Christians and Jews of the day recognized as the singular main driving force in starting this dialogue, um, and whose work is so little known to many, really many within the dialogue, and not just uh, not just little known to those on the outside as well. If I were to say maybe a critical takeaway from it, um, is preparation. Some on both sides were much better prepared to encounter the other than others were. Um, and I think in both cases, it is really essential uh, to have better preparation for all of those involved, which comes not just through study, but also these sorts of encounters, rather than wait every 2 years until we encounter one another again, to have these more regular ongoing contacts as we each learn about the other. I'll leave it there for now, Father Jeffrey, unless you want me to add something else that I forgot or.
Maybe just if you could speak a little bit to the constituency of who attended and how they got appointed to go there, because I think it speaks to that last point you're raising about preparation. You know, some are involved in this uh, I mean, to some extent professionally, but certainly on an ongoing and committed basis. Other people maybe were just sort of last minute diplomatic appointments of different kinds. But I mean, on both the Orthodox Christian and Jewish side, what would you make of the who was there and why were they there, do you think?
Yeah, sorry, I forgot to mention some of the basics. Um, so as far as the Jewish side is organized or represented by for those that don't know, IJKIC, the correct me if I get the International Jewish Committee for Interreligious Consultations. Did I guess? Okay. I've known it as IJKIC for so many years. So I'll let someone from IJKIC, and there are a few people here to speak more specifically about how uh, attendees on the Jewish side end up being attendees. As far as the Orthodox side, this is a history of bilateral meetings that is primarily centered in and sponsored by the Ecumenical Patriarchate. Uh, it is primarily organized in that vein, and but invitation letters to attend are sent to most of the other autocephalous churches recognized by the Ecumenical Patriarchate. Right, so that's not so Father Jeffrey can maybe speak about his OCA background. Um, and then whoever attends from each of those churches is chosen by the autocephalous church. So the Ecumenical Patriarchate doesn't select people, to come from Georgia or wherever. Um, so as has been the case throughout history, the ability or interest, I suppose, or of participants from the autocephalous churches tends to ebb and flow based on that autocephalous church's relationship with the ecumenical patriarchate, as has happened throughout the years. And so some of the representatives that came are often the sort of the ecumenical interreligious person of that church. So in our case, so not necessarily somebody that would specialize in Jewish encounters or Jewish thought or Judaic studies or something like that, but someone who's usually the go-to person for that church on ecumenical in interreligious affairs. Um, Yeah, perhaps I'll leave it at that. I mean, if someone from IJKIC would like to talk about how Jews are selected in that.
It is a parallel process in a slightly different way. IJKIC itself is a consortium. We don't have the same hierarchical structure in the Jewish world that in the Orthodox you do. And while the ecumenical patriarch is first among equals, there's a hierarchical system. In IJKIC, it itself is a consortium of a number of organizations, and each organization is asked to nominate participants. So just as you don't, the Orthodox side doesn't always have significant advance notices who's going to be there in order to do the kind of preparation that Michael was talking about. Similarly, we sometimes don't know who's going to be appointed. The one difference I would say is that we are a little bit more proactive about inviting speakers, which helps us determine a significant part of the attendance, and so that we don't wait until we know who's going to be recommended by the organizations. We will be a little bit more proactive and say we would like this person to be a presenter, which a little bit determines the makeup of our group. But it is also true that there are people who can be appointed who have no particular background in these kinds of dialogues or any history of involvement. I want to, though, as long as I have the floor, just a couple of comments on what Michael said that I think for those that are new to this. A few years ago, we made a very significant and important adjustment in one element of the invitations. When I first started attending these things, whatever number of years ago, 20 years ago or more, many of the people from the Orthodox side did not speak English. And so that there was almost no opportunity for there to be the social interaction around the tables, around the meals, that allowed those kinds of personal relationships to develop. A decision was made, I forget how many of the sessions ago, that we would only invite people on both sides who were fluent in English, and that has made a tremendous difference in the character of the meetings, way beyond the quality of the public presentations. It meant that, and I think some of the people on this call are evidence of that. It meant that there has been the development of a lot of personal relationships, a lot of follow through and follow up that emerged from these meetings, and I think that was an important development. And the only other thing I would say, and others who were there may want to say more, is that one of the things that Michael said is the recognition that that the bilateral dialogue cannot be self-contained. If we are in fact leaders of our communities, we need to address seriously what does it mean to be a leader of communities? How do we convey the meaning of our dialogue? How do we convey what we know about each other? Michael talked about how we teach about each other, but also therefore part of the discussion is not simply the preparation of that paper, which is still in draft form. I mean, I think it's important to be very clear that Michael, I think you'll confirm that what we have is still in draft form. But one of the discussions we will be having is the dissemination. How do we make sure that these insights are shared widely throughout the Jewish world and throughout the Christian Orthodox world? And so that the commitment to have both substantive follow-up and a communication follow-up, I think, is one of the things that's emerged very much out of the last 3 or 4 bilateral meetings. So I think, Jeffrey, I don't know if that adds a little bit to some of the background to the conversations.
Maybe those others who were there, Rabbi Shoshana, Rabbi Joe, if some other things you might want to add. I think for both of you, it was your first time there as well.
I had actually been in Vienna as well, so it
Okay.
was my second, and I was on the committee that helped organize it, which was really helped me engage more deeply and get more understanding of my Orthodox colleagues. I'll name the elephant in the room, or at least one of the elephants in the room, which is a gender elephant. There are very, very few women in the room when we have these dialogues, and I think people have different different reactions to that. I'll say that my reaction is one of just understanding the context that we're working in. And the context is it's a relatively new notion in Judaism, relatively in terms of we're a several thousands-year-old tradition, to have female leadership. And that is, quite a new idea, and therefore even within Jewish circles, there's not always parity of gender. And within the Orthodox world, there's also different leadership models. So there's very few female Orthodox members there, and not that many Jewish female members. I'll just say that my personal reaction to that is one of I don't want gender parity just for the sake of gender parity. I want the right people in the room. I want people who have the ability to participate fully in this dialogue. So it's not a critique of that. On the other hand, there is something about trying to find people who are in those genuine roles of leadership in our respective communities so that we can get that full diversity of experience. So it's not a critique at all. It's just noticing and naming that and thinking about how do we bring that kind of lens into the room with us.
Thank you. Rabbi Joe, any thoughts?
Hi, folks. Nice to be here with you virtually this evening. Just from an affective point of view, I've experienced my first time at this gathering and found it to be very warm, very genuine, very sincere, a tremendous amount of goodwill. The questions, if they were or statements, if they were awkward at times, I think came from a place of genuine curiosity and, for the most part, humility. I just thought it. My sense was that a lot of people towards the end of a short gathering were eager for more. So hopefully they'll continue virtually at some point. If we're naming elephants in the room, another topic that didn't come up as soon as it came up was discussion about a very challenging, obviously a very difficult thing in our historical moment of Israel-Palestine was sort of floated at the beginning and then did not get a lot of airtime in the general conversation. But thankfully there were some side conversations. So hopefully that indicates that people of goodwill can find a language to talk about things, if not agree about things, certainly, but at least to have some communication and at very minimum hear out each other's pain, which is important, certainly important. So overall, I thought it was great to be there. Would recommend. I have two thumbs up. Encourage anyone who's able to take part.
Thank you. We'll sort of pivot now to the document that's been spoken of a couple of times now. Father Michael, you and Rabbi David Sandmill, in the main, we've been working on this draft of a document that's been variously titled, How to Speak About the Other. I think officially the document we were handed said Jews and Orthodox Christians, a unique relationship. And we're not sharing that for the reasons, Richard spoke about, that it's still being worked on and it will be going through official channels, etc., of approval. But maybe just speak a little bit about what you think, or what was established as the problem that this is trying to solve. What is the potential audience for this? What are your hopes for this document?
Yeah, so this came out of the other people can correct me on the history if I'm wrong, but it came out of the Vienna meeting is when we decided to start doing something like this, which was in December of 2022. And then the summer of 23, I was charged on the Orthodox side for being one of the main authors, along with David Sandmel. For those of you that don't know, at the time was the chair of IJKIC, but is not currently, and now is still president, I think, of the ICCJ, the International Council of Christians and Jews, which is the main umbrella organization of Jewish Christian dialogue going back to right after World War II. And so he and I, given our different time commitments and the ebb and flow again of world events and concerns, have been working on this for the better part, a very short document, but have been working on it for the better part of the past 2.5 years or so. Um, but it basically, what we want this to be is something, that a local rabbi or a local priest can stumble upon or have sent along with, in our case, encyclicals from the bishop, a document about informing them about commonalities, shared histories, shared points of contact between Judaism and Orthodox Christianity that either the rabbi or the priest or the different leaders of each community can read and think to themselves, "Oh, I've never been down the street to the synagogue. We have our own Bible studies here, but perhaps we should invite someone from there to come give a talk sometime about Jewish liturgy or Orthodox experience under communism or something like that. Uh, you know, Encouraging points of contact. So the document itself, um, I could read to you part of the introduction. I'm sorry I can't distribute it, as people know, because again, it's hopefully going to have the official stamp of approval eventually. But just to give you a sense of what it's about, the document emphasizes those elements that make the dialogue between Jews and Orthodox Christians unique and therefore necessary, especially for those new to the encounter, uh, and provides initial points with which to build future contexts. It does not presume to tell a complete history of either Judaism or Orthodox Christianity or give a complete review of all of the issues involved. Rather, it provides a common vision in hopes of both shaping future dialogue between these two communities that respects the needs and understandings of the other and encourages further contacts between Jews and Christians on all levels, all official and unofficial, quote unquote, levels. So it has roughly 6 sections, 6 or 7 sections currently. David and I finished a draft and presented it to the people in Geneva in December. We got some comments back, and now we're making some adjustments, and hopefully we'll send it on for another round of approval. But it has a section on basic definitions. So in each section has a couple Jewish paragraphs, and then Orthodox as well. Um, so basic definition. So for example, the Orthodox contribution mentions the word autocephalous and explains what the heck that means, especially for Jews who are possibly more familiar with Protestant and Catholic encounters. It goes through history. It talks about the use of scripture and tradition in each of the two. Um, one uses rabbis, the other one talks about rabbis, the other talks about fathers and how that's similar and can lead to important points of contact. We talk about what we would call the canonical tradition or a similar reflection, the halakhic tradition, which I think will come up again later on. Uh, Issues of modern history and struggles. So, in the case of the Orthodox, the 10 to 20 million people that lost their lives under communism, things like that. And then a few suggestions for future encounters on like liturgical descriptions, liturgical similarities, approaches to the Bible, and things like that. Anything else you'd like me to add?
No, thank you. That's very good. Maybe speak a little bit about the process with David and how I mean, maybe you've each been working independently, but I presume you've been having conversations and what that's been like. I mean, how do you begin to frame some of these uh, questions that you've been delving into and so forth? What are you learning from each other? Just maybe speak a little bit to how the approach to this has been helpful itself.
Um, yeah, so we started off as again about 2.5 years ago and started listing topics of things really jumping off points that we felt were uniquely similar or vocab that we both seem to have. So approach, the necessity of any theological or spiritual or practical discussion, the necessity of the fact that at the table will always be a rabbi or a church father. So we started with this as a topic. Okay, so maybe we should talk about uses of tradition. So we came up with a list of topics, and then started drafting really back and forth. We met a few times to finalize what the kind of topics we were going to address, and then started drafting back and forth. Like I sent him an initial draft that had Orthodox Christian bullet points and a blank space for Jewish bullet points. And then he came back with some. So then we started building, in order to be able to refer to each other a little bit more, we started building. So this grew into what each section now has will be the Jewish clearly labeled Jewish comments on this issue, or review of history, Orthodox Christian, and then a short statement together of a suggestion, especially what can come out of this. So here's modern Jewish history, here's modern Orthodox history, and then a final section where this is similar, where this is overlap, and where it might lead to important and fruitful discussion, especially on the normal level, between local parishes and synagogues.
What was some of the feedback in Geneva to what you shared?
Oh, I'd have to get out my notes for that. uh, Because to give you a little bit of the process, I contacted David, but he needs a few weeks to get back to me, so I put my notes aside. If I remember, there were two things we were going to add, two sections we were going to add. One was primarily related to the early formation of Judaism and Christianity and the mutual influence between them, coming out of the Second Temple period. Um, I don't think one can say, although this is said quite frequently in shorthand, that Christianity grew out of Judaism, because they both grew in reaction to the other in different ways. And what becomes modern, or what became later Christianity and Judaism, was really shaped by, was not entirely immune from being shaped by the other. Um, and it was suggested we add more specifically, um, stress some of the differences, or what makes the dialogue unique between us versus Jewish dialogue with others, or Orthodox Christian dialogue with others. Um, and also suggested it was added, and we will probably add it, a little bit about the figure of Jesus, which was kind of a surprisingly part that was missing in the document. Um, so yeah, unless I'm missing something in my notes, but I might have to go review some of the things we were planning to add. But that's what I remember. I don't. You guys were there too, so.
I think you missed out saying it was generally well received. So
Oh yeah, it was very.
uh,
That part's true. It was very well received. We
yeah,
were very happy with that, because you never know when something, you know, committees about any topic are never the kindest, places to draft something, and especially something like this. So yeah.
Jeffrey, one thing that I would just say that was implicit in what Michael said in his introduction was that because this has been such an intimate process over the last several years, the use of the concept that this is a unique dialogue has sort of been thrown around. And I think that one of the things that came up from the floor was saying it's fine to use that expression, but explain what you mean by why this is such a unique and distinctive dialogue. And I think that that was a piece that was sort of an undercurrent, as to say, if you're going to produce this in this dialogue, what makes it unique? Why is it different? And I think that was an important statement, because there really, and Michael said it earlier, there's a different history about this particular Jewish-Christian dialogue than the ones that are most typically felt in Western Europe and most typically felt in the United States. And so that the distinctive the derivation of why this matters and how it's evolved makes it unique in certain kinds of ways that would not necessarily be inherently obvious unless clarified.
very good. Thank you. And with not only unique problems potentially, but a lot of unique potential to this one. I think that maybe even help to unlock some of the difficulties that have come up in various forms of Western Christian Jewish dialogue. The what was I thinking of just a second ago before that thought came to me? The process going forward at this point, are you guys are going to continue to work on it? Are you involving others in a kind of writing team, or inviting further scrutiny of this before it goes to approval at some stage, or what do you foresee in the coming months?
We will hopefully finalize based on the comments from Geneva. Hopefully, get to a final draft, then I believe I'd have to talk to David about this, but I think will be sent um, to the steering committee for the bilateral meeting, which is about or about roughly three people more recently on both sides. So about six people that hopefully will give approval, and then from there decide exactly how IJKIC wants to give the official stamp, how they have to elicit the initial stamp. And in our case, we have, send it up the hierarchical ladder. Um, and then hopefully, because I think it will have tremendous, more significant impact if it has um, a more official uh, uh, character to it.
Of course, that brings into play one of the complexities of doing something like this, which is very difficult just to say Orthodox Christianity says or believes or practices, and it's the same thing on the Jewish side as well. We're both dealing with very multiform traditions with all their complexities and inner contradictions and everything. So, I mean, I think kudos so far of doing a really good job that was able to meet a lot of, people's approval. But it's in those fine details as you go to the finishing line where there'll be arguments over, framing of certain terms and vocabulary and everything. And it's something that's going to come up as we continue to talk this evening about how we frame educational resources and create them and write texts that are somehow going to be simple for people to understand and yet expressing that complexity that both of our traditions embody. And I think we've even done some initial thinking about what we might be doing at ICCJ this summer by way of a presentation on Orthodox Christian Jewish dialogue. And the idea has come up to speak specifically to that, the fact that we have traditions that are not consistent in their inner life, and how we can begin even to have kind of dialogue on the basis of kind of complex realities, like that and so forth. But I think congratulations so far on a work well done. We're looking forward to this resource. I think given what we've said already about not wanting the dialogue to proceed as a kind of just inner circle or core of kind of elites, but to really involve as much of grassroots communities and people as possible. These resources are going to be the bridge to that, right? Of making sure that what is known and shared, amongst us who are friends and are involved in this in a kind of committed way can also be available to parishes and communities and theological schools and classrooms and everything. So yeah.
Yeah, I want to add one of the I think explicit and intended aspects of this is to sort of in previous bilateral encounters, especially given particularly on the IJKIC side, but also on the Orthodox side, necessary turnover in the participants because of logistical or practical matters. We want to hopefully contribute to a future where the wheel gets reinvented less. Um, that people are coming with a longer history and a more familiarity, specifically with Judaism and or Christian Orthodox Christianity. And this is hopefully going to contribute to something like that.
Thank you. Well, that makes for a good point of segue into the other thing we want to talk about this evening, which is a project specifically of Orthodox Christians in dialogue with Jews. So, just for everyone's reference, this is a working group of the Orthodox Theological Society in America. And, we've been doing for the last couple of years regular webinars and other online events, and doing as much as we can to foster the kind of thing that Father Michael's just speaking about, making sure that the good theological knowledge and wisdom that's being accrued in certain circles can be shared, as much as possible in the church, with a kind of overarching goal of addressing any lingering aspects of anti-Judaism in our preaching, teaching, and worship. And we conceived of a project which is not dissimilar to this educational document, but has a slightly different composition and a slightly different content and audience, and that is a glossary of Judaism for Orthodox Christians. So, in other words, being able to make sense of the sort of beliefs and practices and daily life of Judaism in terms that would make sense for Orthodox Christians. There's a lot of vocabulary terms that people are unfamiliar with. I mean, and by and large, I think a major problem is that a lot of Orthodox Christians don't know of any and aren't encountering and engaging regularly with Jewish friends in order to learn more themselves. So the goal of this project really is it's pitched at Orthodox parishes and seminaries as a way of inviting interest among Orthodox Christians to get to know Judaism and equip them with some background knowledge and possible points in common that would be able to foster and facilitate encounter and relationship building. In other words, what do they need to know to be encouraged to go and knock on their Jewish neighbors' doors and get to know them? And we thankfully received a bit of funding from the Memorial Foundation for Jewish Culture that are helping to put together a web resource and be able to pay for some expertise and making sure that what we're doing is going to be accurate and fair and a good and robust presentation of Judaism, but also offering that commentary, as I say, and that bridge into the world of Orthodox Christianity. So what we want to do this evening is preview a little bit about that and talk a little bit about the process that's going into that. The project itself will eventually be about 50 or 60 different short articles on different terms and vocabulary that relate to Jewish faith and practice. And what I want to do is bring into the conversation this evening two of our Jewish friends who are helping us with making sure we're getting it right. And they're two friends of the project. The first is Benjamin Kamine, who's here this evening, and he holds a joint appointment as lecturer in rabbinic literatures and cultures at the Jewish Theological Seminary and assistant teaching faculty in interreligious engagement at Union Theological Seminary. In this role, he also works as Associate Director of the Milstein Center for Interreligious Dialogue at JTS and as a Special Advisor in the Office of the President at Columbia University. He's a PhD candidate in Midrash at JTS and earned a CAS in Interreligious Studies from the World Council Church's Ecumenical Institute. His academic work focuses on early rabbinic literature and interreligious dialogue. And Ben is also the second vice president of the executive board of the International Council of Christians and Jews that we heard already that David Sandmill is president of, and he's the Jewish co-chair of the International Abrahamic Forum. And our other interlocutor here is Shlomo Zucchier, who is an ordained rabbi and scholar of ancient Judaism and the religions of late antiquity. He earned his PhD at Yale in 2020 and has held postdoctoral fellowships at McGill University, the University of Notre Dame, and the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. He's currently Igor Kaplan postdoctoral fellow in Christian Jewish relations at the University of Toronto. So I've had the pleasure of having him on campus with me. His current research explores the complex interactions among Judaism, Christianity and Islam from their formative periods onward. He focuses in particular on biblical interpretation and theology as key arenas in which these traditions debated and competed, while also borrowing from and learning from one another, which is something that Father Michael recently alluded to. So welcome, Ben and Shlomo. It has been a real pleasure. I mean, I've known Ben for some time, but to get to know Shlomo recently and to involve you in a rather complex project. And I want to just start off with emphasizing how complicated it is, as I was just saying a few moments ago, to talk about what Judaism is, full stop, before you even begin to link this into another tradition like Orthodox Christianity and have a kind of engagement and dialogue there. And almost just start off with a kind of place we got to recently in our discussions about this, which is a recommendation that we leverage an existing resource within Judaism for this project, which we are now happily doing, which is something called My Jewish Learning, which almost uniquely, I could say, enjoys wide support in the Jewish community from all different backgrounds and so forth. So I wonder if maybe one or the other of of you could just speak to that complexity in the first instance and why it's necessary to kind of have a kind of solid basis to work from, rather than to reinvent the wheel, which might involve, the 30 years that My Jewish Learning has taken to build up its database and so forth. So, Ben or Shlomo, one of you maybe speak to that.
We were looking at some of the proposed entries, and I think we're going to look at in a bit of more detail at one of them tonight. And our thought was there's sort of two parts to these entries. One is representing, and I think Father Jeffrey mentioned this a minute ago. One of them is representing sort of the Jewish self-conception, and the other half is sort of an Orthodox theological perspective on that, and noting parallels. And the thought was both it's possible to save some time and effort, but also you sort of can have a native presentation of the Jewish side based on this existing resource at My Jewish Learning. They have really a variety of entries. There are other Jewish resources that are sort of more denominationally, a specific denomination. This tries to be broad-based, so that was the thought as to why it might be useful. And I think they have, again, hundreds and hundreds of entries. Presumably whatever entries this project is going to go with can benefit from drawing on those, not plagiarizing, but rather summarizing and citing. And I think methodologically, it's important that the Jewish side be represented and put forward by Jews rather than sort of through the looking glass from a different perspective. So that I think is, I mean, we're going to see how it goes, but so far that model seems to be working.
Shlomo got it all. The only thing I would add that's a huge benefit from My Jewish Learning is that they have the rights to a bunch of well-known 20th and 20th century Jewish authors whose works otherwise might be difficult to access because they're under copyright, are available as entries on My Jewish Learning, which means that we're not just accessing sort of generic material, but really material that's been vetted by some of the best in the biz, so to speak.
Yeah, and that's tremendously important. So with Shlomo and Ben's help, we've been in touch with My Jewish Learning, and obviously the ask was not, could we just take full articles off of My Jewish Learning and represent them on another site. But what we've been given permission to do, which not every website is happy with, is to do deep linking, right? So for those of you who don't know, a lot of websites would only ask you to link to their front page and then use their own navigation system to find your way through the website. And that's fine as it is. But what My Jewish Learning have said is, no, by all means, link directly into any of the inner content. And I think what I was told by their editor is they have something like 3,000 articles to work from. Now, we're not going to be commenting on all 3,000. That would certainly take most of the rest of our lives to do that. But we're going to very carefully curate the things that connect to those topics that we'd already identified as being interesting points of contact, points of interest, so that we would be able to introduce Orthodox Christians, again, to break down those barriers and create relationships and so forth. And not only to make those deep links, but to have annotated links. So the model for every entry in our glossary is going to be basically a couple of paragraphs of very factual summary of whatever term it is we were addressing, and that will be derived from the sources at My Jewish Learning. And then a number of articles with annotations. So in other words, go and read this. This is what you'll learn from it, with a kind of paragraph that explains, why that is being recommended. And then the commentary that follows will be based on the summary above, as well as the content linked from those annotated links and so forth. And what we thought we would do is demonstrate one of those this evening and then have a discussion around it, which we can do, the three of us, but also involving anybody else who's here in this webinar as a way of seeing the kind of process here. This still remains in draft, so your comments are welcome from whatever quarter, but I will share our entry on our draft entry here on Halakha and Agadah. So I'll read through the summary here. I won't read through each of the linked articles and everything, but I'll read the summary, show you the annotations, and then what an Orthodox commentary on this might look like. Halakha and Agada. In Jewish tradition, the vast body of rabbinic literature divides broadly into two categories, Halakha and Agada. Though found side by side in the same text, the Talmud, Midrashic collections, and other classical rabbinic works, they serve different purposes. Halakha, from a root meaning to walk, refers to Jewish law, the commandments, obligations, prohibitions, and practical rulings that guide Jewish life. Halakha addresses questions of how to observe Shabbat, what foods are permissible, how to conduct prayer, settle disputes, structure marriage and divorce, and order countless other aspects of daily and communal life. Over centuries, halakha developed through rabbinic interpretation of Torah, argumentation about oral legal traditions in the Talmud, codification of legal codes like Maimonides, Mishnah Torah, and the Shulchan Aruch, and ongoing scholarly responsa addressing new situations. Agada, literally telling, encompasses the non-legal material in rabbinic texts, stories, parables, theological reflections, moral teachings, biblical interpretations that expand on the narrative rather than derive laws, and imaginative explorations of scripture. Agada is not binding in the way halakha is. Rather, it explores meaning, forms character, cultivates spiritual insight, and expresses the community's ongoing relationship with God, Torah, and history. Where halakha asks, what must we do? Agada asks, why do we do this, and who are we becoming? Judaism holds these two dimensions in essential relationship. Through explorations of law and narrative, rabbinic interpreters worked on the same cultural needs and tensions, building normative practices and identity-forming stories to bind together Jewish communities in every time and place, and across every time and place. Together they ensure that Jewish life is both rightly ordered and deeply meaningful, that practice is sustained by vision, and vision is embodied in practice. So that's the summary, which is quite straightforward and quite factual. It hopefully doesn't invite a lot of different interpretations and approaches and so forth from different aspects of Judaism, which we're always mindful of. And then here's the example of three annotated links. So there are three articles on the My Jewish Learning. The first is by Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel called Halakha and Agadah. And the annotation here is Rabbi Heschel offers a profound meditation on halakha and agadah not merely as literary categories, but as complementary dimensions of all Jewish existence. He explores how halakha provides structure and discipline, whilst agadah supplies vision and aspiration, and why neither can survive without the other. This is essential reading for understanding the creative tension at the heart of Jewish religious life. The second is an article that the My Jewish Learning editors wrote on Midrash Agadah, exploring ethical ideas, biblical characters, or narrative moments. To see Agadah in action as a textual practice, this article explains where Midrash Agadah appears in rabbinic literature and how it works, expanding biblical narratives, drawing out contemporary meaning from ancient texts, and expressing theological creativity within reverence for scripture. The famous example of Abraham smashing his father's idols illustrates how Agadah shapes Jewish spiritual imagination across generations. And the third one is from Rabbi Louis Jacobs, Halakha Sources and Development. This article traces how Jewish law developed from biblical commandments through rabbinic interpretation to medieval codes like the Shulchan Aruch, explaining the relationship between biblical and rabbinic law. It also addresses how modern scholarship has revealed halakha's historical development, raising questions about how contemporary Jews understand tradition, a tension present within Orthodox Judaism itself. Okay, so having gone potentially and looked at those articles, here is what an entry will then go on to do, which is comment on this from an Orthodox Christian perspective to see parallels, points of divergence, of convergence, and basically points of interest and conversation. For Orthodox Christians encountering this pairing, the resonance may be immediate. The Church likewise holds together normative practice and theological narrative, refusing to let either stand alone. Ethical instruction, ascetical disciplines, canons, and liturgical rubrics order Christian life much as halakha orders Jewish life. Hymnography, homilies, patristic interpretation, and hagiography explore meaning and form the imagination, much as Agadah does. Both traditions resist collapsing faith into either bare rules or disembodied ideas. Yet recognizing this parallel is only a beginning. The real work lies in understanding halakha on its own terms rather than rushing to familiar categories. Historically, many Christians have caricatured Jewish law as legalism opposed to grace, a prejudice that remains embedded in aspects of Orthodox Christian preaching, teaching, and worship. Attempts to identify and overcome this stereotype by arguing that Torah observance has always been a joyful response to God's prior initiative, not mechanical rule-keeping, while well-intentioned, can miss something crucial. Some Jews do embrace what Christians might call legalistic language, detailed attention to measure, precision, obligation. But they do so within a framework where such attention is itself relational, life-giving, and beloved. As Heschel writes, halakha defines, specifies, sets measure and limit. Yet this very specificity is not opposed to love of God, but can be an expression of it. The deeper challenge for Orthodox Christians is not simply to reassign Jews from the bad legalism category to the good grace category, but to question whether the law versus grace framework itself does justice to either tradition. Judaism shows that law can be embraced with joy, that detailed practice can deepen rather than replace inward devotion, and that what Christians sometimes dismiss as externals may be precisely where the Spirit becomes incarnate. Heschel's insistence that the body without the spirit is a corpse, the spirit without the body is a ghost, offers a bracing reminder. Both Judaism and Orthodox Christianity are incarnational traditions where holiness takes concrete, even measurable form. Understanding halakha and agadah together also reveals something important about Jewish textual culture. As the article on halakha's development notes, modern scholarship has shown that Jewish law has a history. It evolved, responding to changing circumstances, and involved real human wrestling with how to live faithfully. Yet this dynamism exists within deep reverence for tradition and continuity. Orthodox Christians, whose own tradition has developed through councils, theological development, and liturgical evolution, while maintaining a strong sense of unchanging truth, may find here not a problem to solve, but a kinship to explore. Finally, the sheer volume and ongoing creativity of Aggadic interpretation, stories multiplying around biblical figures, parables illuminating commandments, theological speculation exploring God's nature and purposes, demonstrate that Judaism has never been satisfied with law alone. The legacy of Agadah means that Torah study remains a living conversation rather than a closed system. For Christians seeking genuine encounter with Jewish neighbors, this openness is an invitation, not to agreement on all points, but to mutual recognition of traditions where faithfulness requires both obedience and imagination, both action and reflection, both walking the path and telling the story. This was chosen not to be an easy one, right? There's plenty of ones in the entries that'll be very easy. This is one of the more complex ones, and it was for that reason we thought it might make a really good subject of discussion here. But Rabbi Shoshana, over to you.
I did not read this before our session, so I'm reacting to it in the moment. And I just want to say I'm profoundly moved by this. And I want to try and articulate why. You've done something quite extraordinary, which is, I think, what Shlomo was saying before, or maybe Ben was saying, of having a Jew, using the original context from my Jewish learning, you're allowing Jews to speak with their own voice and to share something about our tradition. Giving people, references to go deeper on that if they want. But then you're actually modeling, at least for me, what dialogue looks like. I would be assigning this to my students as I'm teaching Jewish students how to do interreligious dialogue, because there's so much that we can learn from that reaction to what you wrote. So I think it's not just the content, which is, as we would say, dayenu. It would be enough. It was just that content that you were putting out there. But there's something about the way that you've done it, the medium in which you're doing it, which embodies the exact kind of dialogue that I am trying to inculcate into my students. So as we would say in Hebrew, Yeshar Koach, that was really, this is a beautiful project, and thank you. Thank you to all of you who are doing it. I look forward to seeing more.
Thank you. Well, that's encouraging. Ben and Shlomo, I wanted to talk, a little bit, with you about, kind of how that came together. Ben and you and I had a really good conversation about an earlier draft of this anyway, in which one of the accusations, as it were, was that I was starting to sound apologetic of not Orthodox Christianity, but of Judaism, right? Because there have been so many, the whole antinomism of Christianity. I mean, to be fair, is very Lutheran, and that's not necessarily an Orthodox Christian, reflex all the time. This idea that law as opposed to grace, etc. But even in the most innocent Orthodox Christian mind, there are so many people that will reflex in those categories. In other words, Jesus came to save us from Judaism, right? Because the law or the law couldn't be performed, or it was incomplete somehow, without him. And so grace comes to kind of save the day, and that is built into a lot of Christian thinking. And so for those of us who don't want to malign Judaism, the first instinct is to say, oh, but you might be thinking Jews are law oriented, but really it's all grace, right? I mean, I've been telling my students when they study the scriptures, right? Notice that the giving of the law is in a narrative and a relational, context. And you almost want to downplay legalism at every turn. And you sort of said you don't need to be apologetic. In fact, you want to reclaim the term legalist. And I thought that was a really fascinating, part of this. And it meant I had to go deeper and further here than just simply reflex, in a kind of using Christian terms to kind of almost redeem Judaism, which is nearly as bad as the antinomism in the first place. Anyway, there's a lot of complexity what I just said. But Ben, over to you, and tell us more about that what you saw in what was maybe an early and obviously faulty attempt to do what we were trying to do. That hopefully, as Shoshana has says, we're starting to get closer to where we need to go. But
Sure, I wouldn't characterize it as an accusation. Um, uh, no, I think that one of the things that you and I talked about fairly early on, that is a relevant question here, right, is the question of audience and the question of who's making use of this resource, and how much we want them to be able to stretch to meet the other dialogically. And one of the challenges is that if the entries are framed too fully in Orthodox Christian terms, or let's just say Christian terms writ large, it sort of cuts off the opportunity to meet the other instead of encouraging it. And I think you and I had literally modeled such an encounter when we were discussing the issue of legalism. And I pointed out that, I would think of our tradition as a living legal tradition, right? Not dead legalism. And that maybe the problem is actually the characterization rather than the content. And so I really appreciated how ready you were to sort of do an about face so quickly on some of these issues. But sorry, just got a note passed to me from outside the room. The only other thing that I do want to add is I think that one of the cool things about this project that we haven't touched on because it's not actually in this entry was we did talk about imagery to go with these entries as well, and that one of the challenges of the imagery was a similar challenge. I think this is just the core dialogical issue is that you want people to be stretching outside their comfort zone, getting to know others on their own terms. But also within a framework that they can find understandable. And I think it was actually my Jewish learning piece was Shlomo's idea, and I'm sure I'd love for her to talk more about it. I think that he sort of hit the nail on the head in terms of not needing to reinvent the wheel. That there's a whole lot of Jewish material on Jewish terms that we ought to just make use of, rather than trying to compose it from scratch.
Shlomo, did you want to?
Sure. So I think Ben expressed very well the success in this piece of dealing with a category that has a broad history within the church, and neither apologizing for nor critiquing Judaism, but sort of presenting, aiming to present Judaism as it is in a positive valence. But I would add, it's also a difficult topic because there's a fair amount of diversity within Judaism in terms of the balance of halacha and da da da. And I think one of the benefits of this project, I think the way it's framed, it's not saying Judaism is X in a hyper specific sense. It's sort of giving a range of views. There's three different articles, you know, one by Heschel, who was affiliated with the conservative movement, one by Rabbi Louis Jacobs, who was affiliated with the Orthodoxy in England. So you get different perspectives even in the representation of Judaism, and on such a tricky topic as this, that's really important. I also wanted to note something that I didn't notice when I read it over previously, but Father Jeffrey, as you were reading it out loud, it sort of caught my attention, and maybe points to some how tricky this can be in terms of the nuance of language. I think there's a formulation about how both Judaism and Orthodox Christianity are incarnational traditions. Now, depending on what if by incarnational traditions we mean that embodied traditions of practice, that's certainly agreeable. But of course, the term incarnation has a certain Christian valence, and I think someone who didn't fully understand the way it was being used, might someone on the Jewish side might bristle at that formulation. So I think that's the one thing that I just noticed now. But I think it points to the trickiness here. Like even these terms, very key terms to the theology of one religion, may have a very different meaning or a different valence for the other, which just shows how challenging this can be. And again, I think I would agree with everyone said that the outcome here is really strong despite all the challenges.
I made a mental note as I was reading it out loud. I'm going to change that to embodied. So I was catching that even before you did. I think it was picking up on the Heschel body without the spirit as a corpse, the spirit without a body as a ghost. But you're right. I mean, we have to, every little bit of wording here has to be carefully chosen. So you guys are going to be great continued collaborators, with this. But the remit here is going to be a lot more restrained in the sense that we'll be building on this solid platform and everything. And I have to give a shout out to Richard here because he was one of the ones who enabled the creation of My Jewish Learning in the first place. Because when he was head of the Bronfman Seagram Foundation, it was one of their last funded projects. So thank you for bringing us this marvelous resource that hopefully more people will get to know. And this was the nature of the conversation I had with Rachel, the editor, the other day, that she's looking forward to more people coming. They're writing primarily for Jews, obviously, but they're more than happy for other people to be reading this. I've got a few hands up here, so rather than just pivoting between us, but I will invite all various kinds of responses to these. But Father Peter.
Yeah, I want to echo Shoshana's comments. I think this is really marvelous and good, and to ask a question back to the original topic is the audience that you're doing this for. And if I may, I would just think that if it was for pastoral concerns, for dialogue, which I think it opens up that dialogue very well in many different ways, I would encourage to think about incorporating scripture references, both from the Jewish tradition and the Christian tradition, that would then become the focus for the dialogue on the subject. Do you follow what I'm saying?
I do. Thank you.
Yeah.
And many of the prospective entries are going to be doing that. Maybe that could be brought to the fore a little bit more in this one. But the other thing we want to do is actually kind of put a maybe final section to each one, which is maybe a bunch of study questions or areas of further reflection, that sort of thing, to really make this a resource that you could bring to, say, a group of students in a classroom or to a study group in a parish or whatever. The overall audience here is primarily theological schools, seminaries, parishes, but with a slightly elevated academic tone, so that it's the people, the catechist or the pastor or the somebody leading the group, as opposed to just trying to bring it down to the very, very, very lay level. But I take on board what you're saying about scripture. That would be that shared resource that we could draw on. Thank you, Father
Thanks.
Peter. Um, unless Olga has reappeared, Svetlana.
Thank you. I'm speaking from the country where it is 2:15 a.m. now, so I'll try to speak very, very shortly. First, I also was shocked a little by the formulation about both Judaism and Christianity are international tradition, and I would support what Shlomo did say. I think when we created this idea of glossary, we did not imagine, in fact, how significant will be a problem of the dialogical language. I mean, that language that does not imposes the meanings of our own tradition on the tradition that we are trying to present. And I think the bigger part of the work on this glossary will not be a theological thing. We have my Jewish learning, we have a bunch of theological sources, but I see it, first of all, as a linguistic work. And it would be a good example for the audience because, as I see, for instance, here in Poland, even in the Judaism-friendly circles, people are presenting Judaism in clearly Christian theological categories. And this is an issue of translation. The next, I think that the greatest value maybe of this glossary would be annotated links, because it gives a wonderful opportunity for people to get a clear vision, or not only of the Jewish ideas, but of the Jewish thinking. Heschel is a great source of Jewish thinking for our contemporaries. And the third, I would support with all my mind, heart, and soul the idea of the questions for reflection and any methodological statements that would show how to use these texts at school, in the seminary, at the educational process. But again, this final part of every glossa, of every essay, should be very clear linguistically, using a proper language, because we are producing a tool for dialogue.
Thank you. And I think it's an argument for getting as many eyes on the entries as possible. So we have our good collaborators, but we'll be sharing, the entries widely as we go along. And I mean, little things like what a word means in different contexts will be really important to hear from different people. We'll never get 100% perfect entries, and the nature of a web resource is at least we can continue to update it and everything. It's not like we're going to print at a certain point, but yeah, we want to get it as right as possible and not create any. I don't know if either Ben or Shlomo wants to respond to anything you've heard just there. Kind of backs up the kind of conversations we've been having anyway. Yeah. Father Michael.
Yeah, two, for what they're worth, quick points regarding first Father Peter's suggestion of scripture. I also think if this is intended audience is primarily Orthodox Christians, resources for them to use, there are a myriad of patristic quotes that would be very valuable here, and especially regarding the paragraph on the legalism in law versus grace, where that distinction is explicitly refused. Um, and to that end, the comment in that paragraph on that a prejudice on the legalism opposed to grace, or the legalism, the law opposed to grace thing, the prejudice that remains embedded in aspects of Orthodox Christian teaching and worship. That is accusatory. I find it better to more be prescriptive that, so as to encourage Christians not to fall into this prejudice or something like that. Because it is a fairly collective accusation that I don't think will be pastorally as helpful for getting Orthodox Christians to read this with friendly, um, more in a friendly way.
The emphasis was on aspect, not the entirety, but no, I've point taken.
I mean, because
Point,
that
point.
legalism thing that you described there is primarily originating, I mean, knowing well this from biblical studies, primarily originating in Protestant, anti-Catholic, and then roped in with Jews are roped into that as well, and then Orthodox Christians as well. So it has a very specific history, that vocabulary, that I'm not sure this communicates in the way that it can.
Happy to take some suggestions around wording that, and obviously the patristic quotes might be extremely useful as a resource alongside this. But I can't tell you the number of times I've heard sermons and the manipulation of patristic tradition to say just that Jesus brought grace and saved us from the need to keep the law and everything, right? So
I would like to dwell on the questions of language for a while, besides what I've written in the chat in my own right. And that concerns the basic terms that you have introduced, namely the opposition between the Agada and the Halacha. These things are not necessarily exactly translated as the Halacha as the law, and Agada as the tradition built on it, because in the Bible, for example, the law is Torah, and it's quite obvious that it. I mean, you could check in the Psalms, for example, when they say, "If it weren't the law that is my consolation, I would have been lost in my misery or poverty, or whatever." Lule Torah shuai azavati beoni. And it's pervasive. Now, the word halacha itself means goings about. That means customs and traditions. And that is probably closer in the Orthodox terminology to the canon as opposed to the nomon. It could be kind of absolutized, but it's not necessarily on the same level. The same thing about the Agada, which is very similar to what we have. It could be midrashic, it could be stories about stuff. It's narrative, essentially. Kind of parables, narrations, stories, etc. And I think that it's one of the problems that the moment we talk about the legalism of the Jewish tradition, or law, as we say it, we are actually believing in kind of an unambiguous translation of these terms, while their connotations differ very much from how they have transpired even in Greek, let alone beyond it. And I think that creates additional projections, prejudices, kind of assumptions that we are using the same notions when we actually don't. A lot of those things boils down to language, translations, etc. For example, in the Psalm 85, with which you started our meeting as a prayer, and in various other psalms, what is translated as righteousness is tzedek, which is neither entirely a personal merit of righteousness, nor entirely legalistic. It means both justice and fairness and righteousness. It's kind of doing right by someone. And I think that it's a very different notion from what transpires when the translation kind of always, whenever it's translated, it gets into a whole different realm of connotations for the word. They differ from language to language. And usually, when we think in a scholarly way, the first thing we have to establish is that we have shared terminology. And all of these translations are either interpretive at best, and at worst, actually sometimes happen to be manipulative. The whole opposition between the law and grace, for even for Paul himself, was very, very different from how this opposition is used by, say, the Kievan Metropolitan Hilarion on his sermon on law and grace. It's not the same notion at all. It is, uh, but it's not the same, say, in Latin patristics either, because everybody introduces their whole personal set of concepts and terms and concepts. I don't even know where to start, with terms or with concepts. And I think that a lot of these misunderstandings actually foster mutual prejudices. So it really a lot of it boils down to language. And I think that besides kind of engaging, or not besides, prior even to engaging in any kind of mutual enlightenment projects, which are very important and which are very advanced and well planned with the website and with the different aspects of it, etc. Before all of that, we have to talk about the translation of terms, not translation, but kind of interpretation, hermeneutics of terms somehow, because we use the same words meaning very different things, or else we use different words in different languages, assuming we mean the same thing. And I think that a lot of these things very often become a source of immense mutual prejudice. That we don't derive what we have in common home somehow. We slightly miss the points. We impose our own terminology on the other, on both sides. I happen to be on both sides. That's why I'm so passionate, that I could see that set of prejudices as indeed mutual. And of course, my métier is language, so that's why I'm so obsessed with this question. But I would not, most of the other stuff that I've done were examples of that in the chat.
Thank you, Olga. I think you're absolutely right about the importance of language in terms, hence a glossary, which seems a very basic set of things, building blocks to be working with, right? Rather than just starting with full-blown essays and everything. I can see a lot of the entries having a lot to do with this word is often translated as, but it doesn't really mean that, and that sort of thing. So any contributions you would like to add to that would be really, really helpful. Inga, you're going to have the last word, I think.
Yeah, no pressure, right?
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, Orlichka is a very hard act to follow, but I just wanted to sort of expand on what I put in the chat, and that is that the longer I live and the more we talk about it in this wonderful group and outside of it, the more I'm aware of how far we need to strip the onion to the very roots. And I'm wondering, I don't quite know how to do that, but I think that something about this glossary, probably the introductory articles into the glossary might provide a way, and or at least some framework. And what I mean is what we've all been talking about tonight, and that is how poorly the Orthodox are educated in their own worship, and how much propaganda is layered over our tradition and our liturgical texts. One of the things that I remember, and everybody who was in the room on that day probably remembers as well, Father Peter, Father John, Father Bogdan, Michael, it's Father Michael, is, for instance, when you said at the OTSA meeting that we are part of the unbroken tradition and we are technically all Jews, the whole room at OTSA made this sort of, there was this wave of uncomfortable shuffling across the room. Like you said something extraordinarily scandalous. And I think where I'm going with it is that I think there will be no way forward without deconstructing some of that propaganda, which hails all the way back to the first century and to the inter-Jewish fights between the groups, between the Christian heretics and the Jewish conservatives before the Gentiles even got involved. So, and that really requires slaughtering some of the sacred cows, which really are not very sacred and probably not really cows.
We are at time, so even on those explosive and important points, we'll have to draw a line. I want to thank everybody for their time this evening, and I hope that we can count on some support, especially for those who have really interesting things to contribute to this. But we've laid out a method for the glossary now of taking some really good material from My Jewish Learning, summarizing that, providing these deep annotated links, and then commenting on it. So if there are particular subjects or things that you would like to get involved in, let me know. We've got a kind of draft list, a rough list of about the 60 different topics that we would like to cover. As Ben alluded, we're really interested in knowing how we can illustrate this thing, because it can go very badly very quickly when you use imagery, because I mean every image is a complicated thing. It speaks 1,000 words, so we're worried about words here. There's 1,000 things that can go wrong with an image, but we're still going to do that. We want to make this pretty as well as informative, and we want to make it really useful and user friendly and that sort of thing, and we'll get there. And I have a rough idea that maybe by the summer we can show some more of this at ICCJ as we do a presentation. Thank you, especially Father Michael, for telling us a bit about Geneva and others who were there, and Ben and Shlomo for your ongoing support of the project. And wish you all a good night. Thank you.